I've already talked to 3 undecided voters.
You may have found the 3.
I mean, they might be the 3 who decide the election.
Okay, so somebody's in a very noisy place. Somebody's in a quiet library. I'm in London. We are really spread out at the moment. I think, Sumi, how are you? Are you in like a nightclub or something?
I wish I were.
I wish.
But if I were in a nightclub at, I don't know, midday on a Thursday.
I would be impressed.
Yeah, I would be impressed with myself as well. No, I'm in a lovely cafe in downtown Doylestown in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This is, I don't know if you've been to Doylestown. It is beautiful. You should definitely come here.
Caitríona, you're in a library or a fake library?
I'm in a fake library.
Yeah.
No, it's not a fake library. It's
full
not
disclosure.
A fake library.
Any library you see on television these days is fake, let's be honest.
Yeah, I don't think there's a librarian on the planet that would let me speak this loudly if I were in a library, but I am in the library corner of the BBC Washington Bureau. So I have nipped into the library corner to have this chat with you guys because it is very busy in this BBC bureau. We've had a lot of reinforcements come into town for the debate this week. Of course, it's been another crazy busy week and a crazy busy month and a crazy busy year. But I'm delighted that us 3 are going to find the time every week to just get together and have a chat about what we've noticed from the campaigns, what's impacting voters ahead, of course, of the 3 of us being together in studio on the big night, election results night in November. And a few days have passed since that big debate now. I think people have had a chance to come up for air and kind of think about what happened, moving away from the sort of dizzy enthusiasm that we saw in the spin room that night. You know, there was a night of claims and counterclaims, studying of body language, stories about eating cats, cat lady endorsements. But I've been really wondering and trying to investigate how much this impacts voters and how much attention people actually pay to it. I mean, we hear from ABC.
You're right, that's the big question.
Isn't it? I mean, we hear from ABC News, 61 million people tuned in to watch this, about 10 million more than watched Trump and Biden in June. But what we got was kind of same old Donald Trump, and we got Kamala Harris trying to shift the focus onto him. So all those polls we saw in advance that people wanted to hear from her, learn more about her and what she stood for. She was very successful, I think, in deflecting the attention onto him. I mean, she laid those traps that he walked into, talking about his crowd size, his vote size, the size of his wealth, and so on. But she didn't answer some of the key questions that people had. The first question she got on the night being potentially the most important, when she was asked, did she think the American people were better off now or were better off 4 years ago, which is the question that Donald Trump and all the Republicans keep hammering her on. And she didn't actually give an answer for that. She didn't have an answer prepared for that. She didn't give too many specifics either. Now, maybe the strategy was to try and keep the focus on Donald Trump. And I was speaking to a high-level Democratic strategist about this, and he had a really interesting takeaway, which was that he felt at the end of that debate, they had succeeded in making Donald Trump look like an old person who wasn't in command of their thoughts, who was rambling and easily distracted.
I mean, he certainly looked like an old cross person.
Which were, you know, the old was the thing that people were saying about Joe Biden, and that they were happy that they had shifted that onto Donald Trump that night, and that they were very happy with how the whole thing went. But I don't know. I mean, we won't know for another week or so if it's had any shift on the polls, but nothing has shifted Donald Trump's performance for about a year. He's been coming in, you know, between 48 and 50%, no matter what has happened to him, including that assassination attempt. So I don't know, do you guys think, will this make any difference?
Well, I'll tell you that I've been speaking to some voters here in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I am, specifically about the debate, because I was curious, you know, how did this actually go down with voters? So it's just anecdotal what I can tell you from here, but really interesting that every person who I've spoken to here about the debates, that they all say that they were disappointed by the performance of both candidates on stage, because they feel like policy issues were not actually address. They feel like one man described it to me like two kids playing in a sandbox or fighting in a sandbox, and that they weren't actually focused on answering the questions that matter to people. And specifically, we've been talking a lot to small business owners, and they're so frustrated about inflation, rising costs, and they feel like neither candidate has actually presented a plan and explained how they would implement that plan to bring down some of these costs. So again, this is anecdotal here, but interesting to note that.
I mean, several times she mentioned specifically small businesses.
She did.
Yeah, that was like, to the extent that she mentioned an economic plan, and she didn't really talk about what that plan would be, but she made a point of talking about small business owners.
And the $50,000 grant that she was going to give to small business owners. But it's interesting when you mention housing, Sumi, because that was something that struck me at the debate. She said, I have a housing policy, full stop, move on. There was no detail on what is a housing policy. And that is something that everyone in this country is concerned about, whether it's access to housing, whether it's rent, whether it's mortgages, whatever form it is, it really matters to people. They need a roof over their heads. And that's the kind of thing that voters vote on, isn't it, when they go into the polls?
I think that, after the kind of sort of giddy euphoria of the night of Democrats being so happy that Kamala Harris had not performed badly, which I think everyone can agree she didn't perform badly. She probably exceeded expectations. Certainly she exceeded the performance of Joe Biden back in June. I'm struck by how many messages I've got from kind of Democratic strategists and how many conversations I've had. I spoke to David Pluff, who ran Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. I spoke to Jim Messina, who ran Barack Obama's successful 2012 campaign this week. And several Democrats have kind of, just in the last even 24 hours, I'm looking at a text that I've just got from somebody this afternoon saying, same swing states, same undecided voters, same lack of clarity. There's been this kind of slight chill has set in. Now, maybe Democrats are very nervous about being too exuberant and they see the polls, but it is striking the degree to which people are asking the questions. I'm assuming to the extent that, you've been talking to voters, I think there's a realization that she gave a good performance, but will that, some people are saying it doesn't even make these set pieces don't make any difference when it comes to the polls. Will that actually change any minds? And I think that seems to be the key question. It sounds like you're both hearing the same thing that I've been hearing, that yes, it was a good performance, but was it enough to persuade people that she had the policies to bring down the price of goods?
I had a few Republicans say to me as well, very privately, they were prepared to admit that it wasn't a great night for Donald Trump, which of course is not what they're all saying publicly. But they said to that exact point, it doesn't matter because he was classic Trump. He delivered that mega mix of classic hit lines about how the Democrats, the Biden-Harris campaign, have destroyed the economy, how the borders are being flooded by immigrants, how other countries are emptying their prisons and their jails and their asylum institutions, and all of this stuff that Donald Trump says at every rally, of which there is absolutely zero evidence of that happening, we have to say. But he delivered all of those lines. So if you're a Donald Trump supporter and you're watching that, or even if you're not, that's what you're expecting to hear from him.
Yeah, definitely. And just in the spin room, we were at the debate in Philadelphia and talked to a bunch of lawmakers and surrogates and members of the campaign teams. And of course, it's a spin room. So you have both sides claiming that they won the debate, of course. But I thought it was so interesting.
Including Donald Trump,
who was just actually two booths down at Fox News. And so we could barely hear or do anything because of the massive scrum that gathered around him, which is usually the case. But, it was so interesting that you heard some of the surrogates for Donald Trump, like Congressman Byron Donalds from Florida, who came down to sit with us and talk to us right after the debate, who said, listen, we very clearly are ahead on these issues, on the economy, on crime, on immigration. And yet when he was making those points, he was able to prosecute that case better than Donald Trump did during the debate itself. And Kamala Harris's surrogates and some of the lawmakers we spoke to, like Veronica Escobar of Texas, a congresswoman, she was saying, look, we know that voters might not know what Kamala Harris's plan is on immigration yet, but we do believe that voters will trust us because they see this performance and they see that she's in command. Again, we'll have to see whether it actually has any sort of impact, but interesting to see that the Harris team on the ground and her supporters as well really were taking so much away from being confident, at least that night, the first night, right after the debate had concluded, by the fact that she had performed better than expected, to your point, Caitríona.
So I had a very interesting conversation. I mentioned David Pluff, who was the kind of guru of Barack Obama's 2008 campaign, in the way that kind of Alan Greenspan was called the oracle of the economy when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve. David Pluff is kind of heralded as this person who can perform miracles when it comes to democratic politics. And certainly 2008 was a very successful Democratic campaign. And I asked him this question that we've been posing about whether it makes any difference. And if so, specifically which groups of the electorate he felt might have been targeted by this debate performance. And I thought it was interesting the way he kind of broke it down to me in three separate groups of people. And now he is a senior advisor to Kamala Harris and he's working on her campaign. So this comes from that perspective. But the way they're kind of micro targeting is kind of worth perhaps framing it. And one is that he felt that there are a lot of voters who want to learn more about her, who don't know much about her, voters of all different ages. And he thinks that's somewhere between 4 and 8% of the voting population. And he felt that they will have got confidence from her performance on the debate stage because she looked like she belonged there, was how he phrased it. She looked, this phrase, she looked like a commander in chief. She looked confident. She kind of owned the stage. She didn't look like she was apologizing for being there. She didn't look nervous. Maybe at the beginning, I'd say the first 5 to 10 minutes, she did look a bit nervous, but he felt that they would have been reassured. So that's one group. Another group, the second group that he spoke about, were people who aren't sure whether they're going to vote at all, and who he felt would have been energized by that debate performance. And I suppose that speaks to the fact that 60 million people tuned into it, which is a sizable chunk of the American electorate, and that they will have seen a high energy performance from her. And that might motivate them, if they've been sitting on the fence, to feel this is something worth going to the polls for. And then the third group of people that they were trying to target, the people who are leaning towards Donald Trump but don't like his character. And I'm sure, you've both heard this out on the campaign trail. I've heard it a lot. People who say, well, I don't really like the things he represents. I don't like the way he talks about women. I don't like some of the kind of antics. I don't like his Twitter feed, but I like his policies. And he felt that some of those people may have been a little demoralized by what they saw on stage, by Donald Trump's performance, by the fact that he came across, as you said earlier, as kind of old, which was a strategy of the Harris campaign, was to use that word old. It was like a drinking game after a bit. Every time she said old story, that you could take another shot. And the other thing I think that's interesting that I've heard from the Harris campaign is that they are super conscious that this is an election that's going to be won on the margins. So even if in each of those three different groups of people, which I think are probably broadly what have been known rather dismissively, I think sometimes, as low information voters or people who make up their mind late, you only need to peel away a few of them, right? You only need to peel away 1,000 or 2 potentially in the swing states, 5,000 in Georgia or 5,000 in Arizona, and you can start having an impact on the outcome of the race. I just thought it was an interesting, from someone who is such a master strategist, in terms of they went into this debate with very clear people they wanted to reach, and that was how they felt they were going to reach them.
Yeah, I think it's quite clever of them in a way, because those people you've described, those sort of low propensity voters, they do tend to vote
much nicer than low information.
Yeah,
voters.
they do. They do tend to vote for Donald Trump, and they're really hard to capture in polls because they're not engaged in sort of the day political cut and thrust as we.
Many of them are kind of women who have kids and they're getting them to school and have other jobs.
They have a life.
Super
exactly.
busy.
They have a life to do. They have shift working to do. They have all of that family stuff, but they do tend to vote for Donald Trump. So it shows just how concerned they are about those marginal voters, that they're trying to target those people at this remove. And I think the other point that's worth noting is we're about to start mail-in balloting, right? Yep. Alabama has already sent out its postal votes. They have to go out to all the states within the next 10 or 11 days. So there are people, that's going to be, an issue. They can cast their vote now, seal the envelope and get it off. And they don't need to worry about, are they going to have to get the earlier bus on election day to get to their ballot centre, or will they have to swap shifts with somebody else and all of that?
Actually, the other really interesting conversation I had this week is I met Deborah Mattinson, who is a British pollster who was advising Keir Starmer in his very successful election this summer on how to win back voters, specifically in the north of England, who had drifted towards the Conservative Party, and to get them back into the kind of Labour fold. I mean, it's the kind of, in Britain it's known as the Red Wall. In America, we would call it the Blue Wall. And she has been doing a string of focus groups and advising, helping the Harris campaign with this issue of how to recapture voters they feel basically working class voters in the Blue Wall. And the key thing that she said to me, and I spoke to her before the debate and after the debate, and before the debate she said the main thing for all of these voters is, the single biggest thing is affordability, and the second biggest thing is immigration. And that she described in her focus group people who've been going around grocery stores. Actually, this was in Georgia, not in one of the Blue Wall states, but she's been looking at the other battlegrounds. And she says, they'll go around the grocery store and they'll put stuff into their basket and they'll tally it all up on their phone, and they'll get to the checkout and they'll have to remove some of it. I can't afford that orange juice this week, so that goes back. And she said it's for those voters that are really hard to reach, that Democrats feel that they want to try and reach. But afterwards, after the debate, it was said, she was very clear that she still felt, to what you've both been saying and what you've been hearing, Sumi, in Bucks County, that the plan, even though Kamala Harris mentioned the middle class a lot and mentioned small businesses a lot and described the $25,000 she's thinking of as a housing kind of grant to help people buy their first house, she felt that there was not a clear enough, crisp enough, strong enough plan to deal specifically with this issue of prices. And I asked her, well, of all the policies that Kamala Harris has mentioned so far, has there been any policy that she's mentioned that has resonated with the people you've seen in your focus group? And she said the only one that's really got traction is the promise to do something about price gouging in supermarkets. So to try and stop supermarkets inflating unfairly their prices. But that's the one policy that Kamala Harris has mentioned that got actually quite a lot of pushback, even from Democratic economists. I mean, it's not something that people particularly like. They say it could actually hurt competition. That's not the way the American economy is went to work. It doesn't sound very free market. So it's interesting that in the focus groups, because she just said people are so focused on the price of goods in particular, and that Harris is going to have to come up with something clean and crisp. And one thing that I thought was interesting is that if you think about Harris, is she's never been known for economic policy. That's not her background, is as a prosecutor, and she's kind of law and justice, and now more recently abortion and people's rights. But if you think of Bernie Sanders is so associated with Medicare for all, Elizabeth Warren associated with corporate profits and corporate power. I mean, even Donald Trump to some extent associated with immigration and the kind of the working. And that's just not what Kamala Harris has been passionate about during her career. But Mattinson's point was that this was something she really has to work on.
And I think that's why we're seeing Donald Trump and the Republicans really trying to skewer Kamala Harris on economic matters time and again, because as you say, that's not something she's known for. And she's trying to distance herself from the Biden administration. But as Donald Trump and all of his spin doctors keep saying, it's the Biden-Harris administration. It's not just the Biden administration. But for me, traveling around this country over the last few months, I've been to 6 of the 7 battleground states so far. It's the number one issue for people. Even when they say economy, they actually mean cost of living. They mean how, I mean, you guys know, we all know from living here, it's impossible to go to the grocery store and spend less than $50. Like, even if you just go in for milk, bread and a couple of apples, you've almost no change out of $50, and you're walking away going, what do I have to show for this? A friend of mine was back home in Ireland recently and sent me a message showing me the boot or the trunk load of groceries that she had bought in an Irish supermarket for the same cost of a basket of stuff here. And so it's a real thing. And yes, wages are rising, but they're not rising in track with the price of things in shops. And that's what people are really feeling in their pockets.
You know, what I've been looking at this week, no surprise, Pennsylvania, since I'm here in Bucks County. And there were 2 things about it that I was really thinking about. You know, coming out to Bucks County, it's one of these collar counties. So outside of Philadelphia, we're about an hour's drive outside of Philadelphia. And you've really seen the growth of these collar counties as people have moved further out from the suburbs into the areas further and further outside of the big city. And that means that, of course, the demographics and the politics also change a little bit as well. We talked to a staunch Trump supporter yesterday who said, I don't like that all these liberals keep moving out here and changing the politics out here. And I think that's a sentiment that we've seen among some of the more Republican leaning voters we've been speaking to. But the other aspect actually tees up to something that Caitríona mentioned a little bit earlier, which is housing. It's the groceries, the gas prices, but every single person we've spoken to has complained about the price of rent or the inability to buy a home. And if you think about, the American dream is often so based on that concept of buying your own home, isn't it? And because of that, the people we've been talking to say they feel like they can't fulfill their potential. They can't fulfill their own dreams because they can't build a house, or they can't buy a house, or they remain renting and they see their rents go up by $600-700. And it made me think about the fact that in 2017, I was traveling around Germany at the time and talking to people about election issues before that country's election. And we assumed that the biggest issue on people's minds was going to be immigration. It was just after the massive immigration crisis in 2015, where you had about 1 million people entering Germany. It was affordable housing in small towns, in big cities. That was the point we kept hearing. And it's so fascinating to see that this is still a big issue here in small towns where I am in Doylestown, but also, of course, in big cities like Philadelphia. And I wanted to look up, I was just looking at the Washington Post. I have some numbers here next to me. Since 2019, home prices have risen 54%. If you add that to the high interest rates and then the low inventory, you can really see the pressure that adds on housing. And of course, you have the policies that are being introduced. So Kamala Harris saying she'll build 3 million new homes and then give down payment assistance up to $25,000 to first-time home buyers. Donald Trump talking about relieving some of those regulatory pressures on building housing. But all of that is not actually going to help the fact that you need new inventory quickly, and all of that takes time. So I really wonder if any of these measures will make a difference. I don't know. What do you think, Katty?
I mean, it's interesting because you heard the same thing in the UK, right?
Right.
Pressures on housing and what a problem and what a big deal that was in the UK general election this summer. It's interesting that you heard, there are similar things in other places in Europe, and you can see how then that ties into immigration. And we are seeing some of that play out kind of online and with some of the Trump campaign, particularly from some of his surrogates and people standing up saying, well, there wouldn't be such high housing costs if it weren't for immigrants moving into our area. That's an argument that I've been hearing from people around the Trump campaign. Now, that doesn't always necessarily correlate. It's not always that simple, but you can see how it's easy from the point of view of the Trump campaign to kind of weave, I don't know if we use that word anymore, weave an argument together that is, that you tie in the economy, as Trump has done kind of masterfully in the past, touching kind of hot button kind of cultural and social issues and people's fears by saying either they're taking your jobs away or potentially, they're driving up the price of housing as well. And one thing I'm watching for as we come out of this debate week and throwing it forwards is how much the Harris campaign now feels they want to get her out, not just at rallies, but, talking as much as possible to the media, talking in town halls, doing the reps. I mean, practicing bicep curls, but I mean, getting her out as much as possible to hone this specific economic message. And whether they feel that would, I know that they've kind of resisted that up until the moment of the debate, but I think they will feel not just pressure from the press, from all of us, and from the Trump campaign, as clearly there is pressure from the Trump campaign around this, and kind of goading her into doing that, but also whether they think that they're going to need to do that if the debate alone hasn't totally sold the case, that she hasn't made, the sale with some of those key demographic groups yet.
Do you think that some people also in a state like Pennsylvania might just not vote? Because until now, I haven't found anyone who said they won't vote. They just haven't decided yet how they would vote.
I think that was a real risk earlier in the year, wasn't it? I think so much has happened that people do feel a bit more energized. That's what I've had anyway.
I often wonder when people come up with a microphone, and I've had this many times going around kind of battleground states, and everybody always tells me they're going to vote. And I just wonder, occasionally I'm a little bit skeptical, and I think there is a difference between telling a journalist who is asking you, are you going to vote? And your kind of sense of civic duty kicks in and you say, yes, of course I'm going to vote. I just haven't decided who to vote for. And actually kind of doing the paperwork and getting to the ballot box. And because clearly we know American elections don't have massive turnout. So there are a lot of the electorate who choose not to go out and vote. So we'll see what the actual turnout is going to be in November.
We will.
Always a good number to watch.
And a long road from here to there, even if it's only a matter of weeks. Plenty can happen, as we know. And we will be back here each week talking about what we've seen and heard through the week. But we'll leave it there for today and chat soon. Sumi and Katty, see you guys soon.